Marcus Grayson didn't see the truck until it was too late. He'd been gliding down El Camino Avenue, Sacramento's skyline bleeding gold and crimson as the sun dipped below the horizon, the Toyota Camry's tires humming a steady rhythm against the asphalt. The day had been a grind 8 hours of meetings, a stack of reports he'd barely dented, and a headache that pulsed like a drumbeat behind his eyes. The radio crooned a lazy jazz tune, Miles Davis' trumpet weaving through the hum of the air conditioning, a balm for the chaos of his 9 to 5. He was 3 miles from home, close enough to taste the relief of kicking off his loafers and sinking into the couch with a beer. A horn blared sharp, guttural, a primal scream from his left. Marcus' head snapped toward the sound just as a rusted Ford F-150 roared through the intersection, its headlights glaring like a beast's eyes. Head slowed at the yellow light. Slowed, not stopped. Sure, but the truck didn't care. It was a runaway freight train, barreling through the red like traffic laws were a suggestion. Marcus' foot slammed the brake, instinct overriding thought, and he yanked the wheel hard to the right. The Camry fishtailed, tires screeching a high-pitched wail as the chassis shuddered. His coffee mug forgotten in the cup holder launched like a missile, splattering lukewarm sludge across the dashboard. The truck missed him by a hair, its side mirror clipping his bumper with a sickening crunch. The driver, a blurry figure in a baseball cap, thrust a middle finger out the window as the truck roared off, taillights fading into the dusk. Marcus' chest heaved, his breath coming in jagged bursts as he wrestled the car back under control. His hands trembled on the wheel, adrenaline flooding his veins like liquid fire. Motherf, he started, but the curse died in his throat. Red and blue lights erupted in his rearview mirror, sharp and relentless, slicing through the fading jazz like a blade. A police siren wailed a banshee's cry, loud enough to rattle his skull. He blinked, his brain scrambling to catch up. The light. He'd rolled through it, yeah, but that near miss with the truck had to be what triggered this. He eased the Camry to the curb, gravel crunching under the tires, and killed the engine. The air conditioning whirred faintly as he rolled down the window, the evening heat creeping in, thick with the scent of exhaust and asphalt. He flicked his eyes to the side mirror. A police cruiser parked tight behind him, its strobing lights painting the street in jagged pulses. The door swung open, and out stepped Officer Travis Keller, a wiry figure in his late 30s with a buzz cut so sharp it could have doubled as a weapon. His badge gleamed on his chest, catching the last rays of sunlight like a trophy, and his belt jangled with every step keys, cuffs, holster a symphony of authority. Keller swaggered toward the Camry, his boots scuffing the pavement, radiating the kind of cocky energy that screamed, "I own this block." Marcus adjusted his tie, forcing his pulse to slow. He wasn't new to this game. He'd been pulled over before too many times for it to be random, but something about Keller's stride, the way his hand hovered near his hip, told Marcus this wasn't going to be a quick fix your taillight chat. "License and registration," Keller barked, planting himself by the window. His voice was a flat drawl, laced with just enough edge to make it clear he wasn't asking. One hand tapped the roof of the car, the other rested casually near his holster, fingers twitching like a gunslinger itching for a draw. Marcus didn't flinch. He reached into the glove compartment, slow and deliberate, pulling out the registration with the precision of a man defusing a bomb. His wallet came next, the leather creaking as he slid his license free and handed both over. "Here you go, officer," he said, his tone polite but firm, a tightrope walk between respect and resolve. His heart still thumped from the near crash, but he buried it deep. No cracks, no weakness. Not here, not now. Keller snatched the documents, his eyes flicking over them with a predator's scrutiny. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" he asked, leaning closer, close enough that Marcus caught a whiff of stale coffee and cheaper cologne. His buzz cut cast a shadow across the window frame, and his jaw worked a piece of gum like he was chewing on his own impatience. "Not entirely," Marcus replied, keeping his voice level, his gaze steady. "I slowed at the light, thought I timed it right. Was it the truck? Damn near took my front end off." Keller's lips twitched, a flicker of something annoyance. Maybe, but he didn't answer right away. Instead, he lingered, his eyes narrowing as he studied Marcus' face, then the suit, then the coffee-stained dash. "You didn't come to a full stop," he said finally, though there was a hitch in his tone, like he was testing the excuse to see if it'd stick. Rolling through still a violation. Marcus frowned, nodding slightly. I see. Thought I had it, but I'll take your word for it. That truck threw me off, came out of nowhere. Keller didn't respond. He straightened up, folding Marcus' license and registration with exaggerated slowness, his fingers lingering on the edges like he was savoring the moment. Then he tucked them into his chest pocket, a smug little move that said, "I'm in charge here." His posture shifted, shoulders squaring, chin tilting up, a subtle but unmistakable signal that this wasn't ending with a warning. Marcus felt the air thicken, the tension coiling like a snake ready to strike. He'd seen this play before. The moment a routine stop turned into something personal, something loaded. Keller's eyes locked onto his again, sharp and searching. "You're not from around here, are you?" Marcus paused, just for a beat, letting the question hang. "Moved here a few months ago," he said, nodding toward the pocketed documents. "Address is on the license." Keller barely glanced at it. "Where you headed in such a hurry?" "Just home," Marcus said, his tone still even, but the edge in Keller's voice was starting to grate like sandpaper on glass. The officer wasn't asking because he cared about Marcus' commute. He was asking because he'd already decided Marcus didn't belong here, didn't fit the script of a guy in a suit driving a Camry through this part of town. Marcus knew that look, that tone. It wasn't about the light or the truck, it was about the color of his skin, the assumptions that came with it, the unspoken checklist Keller was ticking off in his head. Black guy, nice car, must be trouble. Keller stepped back, his smirk faint but unmistakable, a predator sizing up its catch. "Step out of the car for me." Marcus' grip on the wheel tightened, his knuckles whitening for a split second before he forced himself to relax. The near crash still buzzed in his veins, but he shoved it down, locking it behind a wall of control. "Is there a reason for that, officer?" he asked, his voice measured, a steel thread running through it. He wasn't challenging, not yet, but he wasn't rolling over either. Keller's smirk faltered, but he recovered fast, his jaw tightening. "I asked you to step out. You don't want to make this harder than it needs to be." The threat was there, loud and clear, a dare wrapped in authority. His hand drifted toward his holster, not touching it, just hovering, a twitchy little move that screamed insecurity more than power. Marcus exhaled through his nose, slow and controlled, then popped the door. He stepped out, standing a good inch taller than Keller, his broad shoulders filling out the tailored suit he'd worn to the office that morning. His polished loafers gleamed under the fading sun, a stark contrast to Keller's scuffed boots, caked with the dust of a dozen patrols. He didn't slouch, didn't fidget, just stood there, calm as a statue, his presence a quiet rebuttal to Keller's bluster. The officer gestured toward the front of the car, his movements jerky, impatient. "Hands where I can see 'em." Marcus complied, placing his palms flat on the hood, the metal warm against his skin from the day's heat. "This still about the light?" he asked, his tone low but pointed, a scalpel slicing through the bullshit. "Or are we looking for something else, like, say, incidents involving guys in suits driving home?" The jab landed like a slap, and Keller's eyes narrowed, his gum chewing pausing for a split second. "Watch your tone," he snapped, his hand drifting toward his holster again, a reflex, not a necessity. "We've had some trouble around here. You can never be too careful." "Trouble with guys like me, huh?" Marcus said, his voice cutting through the pretense like a blade. "Or does this have more to do with how I look than what I did? 'Cause last I checked, suits and sedans don't scream trouble, unless you're seeing something I'm not." Keller bristled, stepping closer, his breath hot and quick. "You seem real familiar with how this works. Got something to hide?" Marcus let the silence stretch, his eyes locked on Keller's, unflinching. "No, officer. Just believe in clarity, transparency, things you're supposed to stand for." His words were calm, deliberate, but they carried a weight that made Keller's bravado look flimsy, like a house of cards in a storm. Keller scoffed, pacing a tight circle in front of the car, his boots crunching the gravel with every step. He wasn't used to this, someone who didn't buckle, didn't stammer, didn't give him the reaction he craved. Marcus wasn't playing the game. Most folks would have been sweating by now, begging for a break, but Marcus stood there like he owned the damn street, his suit crisp, his posture steady, his gaze unflappable. It was driving Keller up the wall, and the officer didn't know how to handle it. He was a blunt instrument, brash, loud, fueled by gut and ego. Marcus was a scalpel precise, controlled, cutting deeper with every word. "You're pretty confident," Keller muttered, almost to himself, his voice tinged with something sour. "Like you think you've got this all figured out." "Confidence isn't the issue," Marcus shot back, tilting his head slightly, his tone still even but laced with an edge. "Respect is, and I'm not seeing much of it here." Keller froze, his smug mask slipping for a heartbeat before something harder took its place. A flash of anger, maybe fear. "Turn around," he ordered, his voice clipped, his hand tapping his belt like a nervous tick. "Hands on the hood. Need to check for weapons." Marcus raised an eyebrow, incredulous but still calm. "Weapons?" he repeated, letting the word hang in the air like a bad joke. "Do I look like I'm packing heat in a three-piece suit? What's next, gonna frisk my tie for a shiv?" Keller's jaw tightened, his gum-chewing resuming with a vengeance. "I'm not asking again." Marcus hesitated, a flicker of something anger, maybe exhaustion crossing his face before he turned and planted his hands on the hood. The near crash still echoed in his bones, the truck's horn a ghost in his ears, but he buried it deeper. Keller stepped up, patting him down with rough, jerky movements, his hands lingering like he was praying for a reason to escalate. He checked the pockets, the waistband, even the cuffs of Marcus' pants. Nothing. No gun, no knife, not even a damn pen that could pass for a weapon. Just a wallet, a phone, and a set of keys jangling faintly. "You're clean," Keller grunted, stepping back, the words sour in his mouth, like he'd bitten into something rotten and couldn't spit it out. "Of course I am," Marcus said, turning to face him, his eyes sharp as razors, his voice steady but loaded. "Now, officer, if you're done." "I'm not done," Keller cut in, his voice rising, betraying his desperation to stay in control. "You seem to know a lot about what I can and can't do. Care to explain?" Marcus folded his arms, his posture relaxed, but his presence towering, a quiet storm brewing beneath the surface. "I've had my share of run-ins with cops," he said, his tone steady, but weighted with years of history. "Let's just say I've learned a thing or two, mostly about what happens when the badge forgets what it's for." Keller stepped closer, his voice dropping to a growl, his breath hot against the cooling air. "What are you, some kind of lawyer?" Marcus smiled faintly, a glint of something dangerous in his eye humor. "Maybe. Or the promise of a reckoning. Something like that." The vagueness lit a fuse in Keller. He leaned in, invading Marcus' space, his buzz cut casting a jagged shadow across the hood. "You think you're smarter than me? Think you can talk your way out of this?" His voice was a snarl now, all pretense of professionalism gone, replaced by raw, petty frustration. Before Marcus could answer, his phone buzzed in his pocket, a sharp, insistent vibration that cut through the tension like a knife. He didn't move to grab it, keeping his hands visible, but the sound grated on Keller's nerves. "Who's that?" the officer snapped, his eyes darting to Marcus' pocket like it was evidence of a crime. "Probably my wife," Marcus said, his tone casual but tinged with something softer, a crack in his armor. "She's been waiting for me to get home." Keller scoffed, a harsh bark of a laugh. "Yeah? Maybe you should have thought about that before rolling through my light." Marcus' jaw tightened, but he didn't rise to the bait. The phone buzzed again, insistent, and this time he couldn't ignore it. "Mind if I check that, officer? Just to let her know I'm okay?" Keller's eyes narrowed, his hand twitching near his belt. "Keep your hands where I can see 'em. You'll decide what's okay." Marcus nodded, slow and deliberate, then reached for the phone with exaggerated care, pulling it out and glancing at the screen. 2 missed calls, Lena. A text flashed up. "Where are you? You said 6:30. Everything all right?" The clock on the dash read 7:12. He was late and she was worried again. The tension in his chest tightened, not just from Keller's bullshit but from the strain he'd been dodging at home. Lena had been patient, too patient, with the long hours, the late nights, the way he carried work into every corner of their life. This wasn't helping. "She's worried," Marcus said, more to himself than Keller, slipping the phone back into his pocket. "Can we wrap this up?" Keller's smirk returned, sharper now. "Oh, well, wrap it up when I say we're done. You don't call the shots here." Marcus met his gaze unflinching. "I don't think anything, officer. I just believe in fairness. And so far, this ain't it." Keller's face twisted, the words hitting a nerve he couldn't hide. "Fairness? You think this is about fairness? People like you always." He stopped himself, but it was too late. The slip hung in the air like a guillotine blade, heavy and damning. Marcus' eyes narrowed, his voice soft but lethal, cutting through the dusk like a whisper of steel. People like me? Keller backpedaled, his tone weaker now, scrambling to regain footing. You know what I mean. I think I do, Marcus said, his calm turning razor-sharp, slicing through the pretense with surgical precision. And I think we both know this stopped being about a traffic light a long damn time ago. Keller opened his mouth, but nothing came out. For the first time he looked lost, like a man who'd swung at a shadow and hit air. Marcus wasn't just holding his ground, he was shifting it, and Keller was floundering. The officer's hand twitched near his belt again, his frustration boiling over. But before he could double down, Marcus' voice cut through the haze, steady as steel, cold as ice. "Officer," he said, his tone unyielding, "I think it's time you know who I am." Keller snorted, clawing for control, his bravado a crumbling fad. "I don't care who you are." "You will," Marcus said, reaching into his pocket slowly, deliberately, watching Keller's hand hover near the holster like a nervous tick. "I'm pulling out my badge. No sudden moves, so you don't get twitchy." Keller's eyes tracked Marcus' hand as he flipped open a leather wallet, revealing a badge that gleamed brighter than Keller's ever would. Polished and authoritative, a symbol of something bigger than this petty power play. "Marcus Grayson," he said, casual as if they were swapping business cards over coffee. "Head of Internal Affairs, Sacramento Division." Keller froze, his face draining of color, his swagger evaporating like smoke in the wind. His gum fell still, his jaw slack. "Internal Affairs?" he croaked, the words barely audible, a choked whisper against the siren's fading echo. "Yeah," Marcus said, stepping forward, closing the gap Keller had tried to widen, his presence towering now, unassailable. "I oversee officer conduct. Make sure the badge means something more than a free pass to harass whoever you feel like." Keller's hand fell limp at his side, his eyes darting between the badge and Marcus' unflinching gaze. "You're..." Disappointed, Marcus finished for him, his voice low and piercing, a blade sliding between ribs. "Not just because you profiled me, though, that's bad enough. Not just because you escalated this for no damn reason after I almost got T-boned by that truck. It's because you did all this without even knowing who I was. You assumed I wouldn't know my rights, wouldn't push back, wouldn't matter. And why? Because I don't fit your picture of someone who deserves respect?" Keller's mouth opened, then closed, his bravado crumbling under the weight of Marcus' words. A house of cards toppling in the breeze. "I didn't..." "You did," Marcus cut in, unrelenting, his tone a quiet storm that drowned out Keller's excuses. "And that's not just a problem for me, it's a problem for every single person you pull over, every single life you disrupt because of what you think you see instead of what's real." Keller's shoulders slumped, his face reddening as the reality sank in, a slow bleed of shame and panic. Marcus stepped back, giving him space but not letting up, his voice dropping to a near whisper, heavy with promise. "Here's what's gonna happen," he said. "You're gonna hand me my documents, take a long look in the mirror, and think real hard about what comes next. Because you will hear from me again, not as some guy you stopped on a hunch, but as the man who decides if you're fit to wear that badge." Keller's hands shook as he fumbled for Marcus' license and registration, pulling them from his chest pocket like they burned. He handed them over, his fingers trembling, his eyes avoiding Marcus' gaze. Marcus took them, tucking them away with a slow, deliberate calm, then opened his car door, pausing with one foot inside. "One last thing, Officer Keller," he said, turning back, his voice a quiet thunderclap in the dusk. "The badge doesn't make you king. It makes you accountable. Remember that." He slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and pulled away, the Camry's taillights fading into the night. Keller stood there, a shadow in the dying light, his confidence shattered, his future teetering on the edge of a blade. For Marcus, though, this was just the beginning, a spark that would ignite a fire he'd been waiting to set for years. The Camry's engine growled to a stop as Marcus Grayson pulled into his driveway, the Sacramento night swallowing the last traces of daylight. The dashboard clock blinked 7:48, over an hour late, a glaring red accusation against the black leather interior. The house stood ahead, a modest two-story with peeling paint and a porch light flickering like it was on its last legs. Lena would be inside, probably pacing the kitchen or pretending to read, her worry bubbling beneath a surface of strained calm. Marcus gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles still tight from the traffic stop, the memory of Officer Travis Keller's smirk clawing at his mind like a splinter he couldn't dig out. He grabbed his briefcase from the passenger seat, the leather streaked with coffee from the near crash, a bitter reminder of how close he'd come to a crumpled hood and a hospital bed. Stepping out, the cool air hit him like a slap, sharp with the scent of eucalyptus and distant exhaust. His polished loafers crunched on the gravel path as he headed for the door, the badge in his pocket feeling less like a shield and more like a loaded gun. As head of internal affairs for the Sacramento PD, Marcus had spent years chasing down dirty cops, guys who bent the rules until they snapped, who hid behind their badges like it was armor. But Keller, that wasn't just another stop. It was a flare in the dark, a taunt he couldn't ignore. People like you, the words looped in his head, a racist dog whistle he'd heard too many times to count. The front door creaked as he stepped inside, the warmth of the house wrapping around him like a hesitant embrace. The air smelled of garlic, thyme, and a hint of burnt onion. Lena's cooking, a ritual she clung to even when the world felt like it was fraying. She stood at the stove, her back to him, stirring a pot with a wooden spoon that looked like it'd seen better days. Her hair was pulled into a tight bun, a telltale sign she'd been stressing, her shoulders stiff beneath a faded blue sweater. "You're late," she said without turning, her voice clipped but soft, a tightrope stretched between relief and something sharper. "Yeah," Marcus said, setting his briefcase by the door, the thud echoing in the quiet. "Got held up." She turned then, her brown eyes locking onto his, sharp and searching, cutting through the dim light of the kitchen. "Held up how?" "You didn't answer my calls, Marcus." The spoon paused mid-stir, hovering over the pot like a gavel waiting to drop. A strand of hair slipped loose, curling against her cheek, and she brushed it back with an impatient flick. Marcus hesitated, the truth teetering on his tongue like a live wire. "Traffic stop," he said finally, keeping it vague, his tone measured. Took longer than it should've. Lena's brow furrowed, her grip tightening on the spoon until her knuckles paled. "Another one?" "That's the third time this year, Marcus. What the hell's going on out there?" Her voice rose, not loud but insistent, cracking the calm she'd been holding on to. He shrugged, forcing a casual air he didn't feel, his hands sliding into his pockets to hide the tremor still lingering from the adrenaline. "Just a cop with an itch. Nothing I can't handle." She didn't buy it. She never did. Her eyes narrowed, pinning him in place like a spotlight. "You're not invincible, you know," she said, her voice dropping, weighted with a mix of fear and exhaustion that hit him harder than any punch. "You keep saying it's fine, but it's not. I see it in you every damn night you bring this home. You're not sleeping, you're barely eating, and now this. Another stop? What's next, Marcus, a bullet?" He crossed the kitchen in 3 strides, resting a hand on her shoulder, feeling the tension coiled there like a spring ready to snap. "I'm okay, Lena, promise. Just need to eat something and crash. Long day." His voice was steady, a lifeline he threw to both of them, but it felt flimsy even to him. She studied him for a long moment, her gaze peeling back layers he didn't want exposed. "Not tonight." Then she nodded, turning back to the stove, the spoon resuming its slow dance in the pot. "Dinner's ready. Chicken stew. But we're talking about this later. You don't get to keep shutting me out. Not when it's eating you alive." He didn't argue. He couldn't not when she was right. The stop with Keller wasn't a blip. It was a fault line, and he could feel the quake building. He sat at the table, the chair creaking under his weight, and watched her ladle stew into bowls. The steam rose in lazy curls, the scent grounding him for a moment, but his mind was already elsewhere, back on El Camino Avenue, back to Keller's twitchy hands and that smug, "Step out of the car." This wasn't over. It was just beginning. The next morning, Marcus was at his desk in the Internal Affairs office before the sun breached the horizon, the Sacramento skyline a gray smudge beyond the window. The room was stark white walls scuffed with years of neglect, a metal filing cabinet dented from some long-forgotten tantrum, a coffee mug he hadn't touched since yesterday crusting over with stale brew. A file lay open in front of him. Officer Travis Keller. He'd pulled it from the system at 5 a.m., driven by a gut feeling that wouldn't let him sleep. Lena had been right. He had barely closed his eyes, the stop replaying in his head like a broken record, Keller's voice a needle scratching the groove. Keller's record wasn't spotless. But it wasn't a neon sign, either scattered complaints of unprofessional conduct, a handful of excessive stops, vague misunderstandings that never stuck. Slaps on the wrist, hushed up with a wink and a nod, buried in the bureaucracy like dirty laundry. Marcus flipped through the pages, his fingers leaving faint smudges on the edges, his eyes catching on a pattern. Stops clustered in certain neighborhoods: Oak Park, Del Paso Heights, Meadowview, places where the houses sagged under the weight of time, where the streets cracked like old skin, where folks like Marcus stood out in a suit and tie. Black drivers, mostly men, pulled over for failure to signal or suspicious behavior, searched at twice the rate of their white counterparts, often with nothing found. The stats weren't in the file, they were in Marcus' head, burned there from years of sifting through the department's dirty secrets. He paused on a complaint from 2 years back. A 23-year-old named Darius Webb stopped for erratic driving on Florin Road. Keller's report claimed Webb reached for something under the seat, justifying a search. Nothing found, no ticket issued. Webb's statement, buried in an addendum, said Keller shoved him against the car, called him boy, and laughed when he asked for a supervisor. The complaint went nowhere. Insufficient evidence. Case closed. Marcus' jaw tightened, a slow burn spreading through his chest. He'd heard that laugh last night, that same low, ugly sound. Then he saw it. A training log from 5 years back, tucked in the back of the file like an afterthought. Keller had gone through a tactical enforcement program run by Deputy Chief Victor Hayes. Marcus' pulse quickened, a jolt of recognition cutting through the fatigue. Hayes, a name that lingered in the department like a bad smell, a ghost you couldn't pin down. A grizzled vet with salt and pepper hair and a voice like gravel, Hayes was the kind of guy who talked about keeping order like it was a crusade, who wore his 30 years on the force like a crown. Marcus had clashed with him once, years ago, over a brutality case, a rookie cop who'd cracked a kid's skull during an arrest. Hayes swooping in to call it justified force and bury the evidence. The man was a shadow king, always there, never accountable, pulling strings from the top while guys like Keller did the dirty work. Marcus grabbed a pen, scribbling a note. Hayes connection, the ink bleeding slightly into the paper. He reached for his phone, dialing Carla, his assistant, his fingers drumming the desk as it rang. Carla, I need Keller's full personnel file, disciplinary history, training records, everything. And cross-check it with Hayes' programs. Anything that ties them together, I want it yesterday. You got it, boss, Carla said, her voice crisp through the speaker, a hint of coffee-fueled energy cutting through the early hour. This about last night? Heard you had a run-in. Marcus paused, surprised she'd picked up on it so fast. Office gossip moved like wildfire. Yeah, something's off. I can feel it in my bones. Be careful, Marcus, she said, quieter now, a thread of worry weaving through her words. Hayes doesn't like people sniffing around his turf. He's got eyes everywhere. I'm counting on it, Marcus replied, a faint smirk tugging at his lips despite the weight on his shoulders. Let him see me coming. He hung up, leaning back in his chair, the springs creaking under him. If Hayes was the puppet master, Keller was the marionette, and Marcus was about to cut the strings, one snip at a time. Across town, in the stale air of Precinct 4's locker room, Officer Elena Vasquez wrestled with a decision that felt like a noose tightening around her neck. She was 26, 6 months out of the academy, her uniform still stiff with newness, the creases sharp enough to cut glass. Her badge gleamed on her chest, a shiny promise she'd pinned her hopes on when she'd signed up. Naive, maybe, but real. She'd joined the force to make a difference, to be the kind of cop her abuela could brag about back in Stockton, the kind who helped instead of hurt. But 6 months in, she'd seen enough to know the system wasn't what the recruitment posters sold. It was a machine, cold and grinding, and cops like Keller ran the gears. Guys who flexed power like a muscle, who laughed off complaints like they were punchlines, who looked at her like she was a kid playing dress-up. She sat on a bench, her locker open, the faint clang of metal echoing as someone slammed theirs shut across the room. A USB drive burned a hole in her palm, its edges digging into her skin as she gripped it tighter. She'd found it by accident 2 days ago, tucked in a drawer in the evidence room while she was logging a DUI report. A glitchy dashcam file from Keller's cruiser, dated 3 weeks back, marked corrupted and shoved where no one would look. Curiosity had gotten the better of her. She'd taken it home, plugged it into her laptop, and watched it alone in her cramped apartment, the grainy footage flickering on the screen like a nightmare she couldn't unsee. It was Keller. Pulling over a kid couldn't have been more than 19, black, skinny, driving a beat-up Honda Civic with a busted taillight. No ticket, no warning, just a search, rough and unprovoked. The footage showed Keller yanking the kid out, shoving him against the car, his hands patting him down with a force that made Elena flinch. "Where's the dope, huh?" Keller's voice barked through the speakers, thick with menace. "I know you've got it. Don't play dumb." The kid stammering, I swear, his voice cracking, high and scared, his hands trembling as he held them up. Keller laughing, a low, ugly sound that sent a chill down Elena's spine, then muttering, "Keep your ass in line, or next time I won't be so nice." Nothing found, no drugs, no weapons, but the stop dragged on for 20 minutes. The kid left shaking, his hoodie twisted from Keller's grip. The file cut out abruptly, static swallowing the end. Elena's stomach had churned watching it, bile rising in her throat. This wasn't policing, it was predation, a power trip dressed up in blue. She'd heard whispers about Keller, how he kept the streets clean, how he had friends upstairs who covered his tracks, how he'd once bragged about teaching punks a lesson over beers at a cop bar. She'd seen the looks from other officers don't rock the boat. Rookie, the unspoken rule that you kept your head down, your mouth shut, if you wanted to survive. But this was a line she couldn't unsee, a crack in the facade she couldn't ignore. She had copied the file to the USB, her hands trembling as she did it, the hum of her laptop the only sound in the dark. Now, sitting there in the locker room, the weight of it pressed against her skin like a loaded gun, cold and heavy. She could turn it in, blow the whistle. But what then? Her career barely started would be torched. She'd be the snitch, the pariah, maybe worse. She had heard stories, cops who spoke up getting sidelined, harassed, their tires slashed, their lockers vandalized, run out of the force with nothing but a bad rep. But if she didn't, that kid's face, scared, helpless, eyes wide with terror, would haunt her, a ghost in her sleep, a weight on her soul she couldn't carry. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of the spiral. A text from her training officer, Sergeant Ortiz. "Where you at, Vasquez? Patrol starts in 10. Move your ass." She shoved the USB into her pocket, the edges digging into her thigh, and slammed the locker shut, the clang echoing like a gunshot. She'd decide later after shift, after she could breathe. For now, she had to survive the day, keep her mask on, play the part. But the USB was a ticking bomb, and she knew it. Back at Internal Affairs, Marcus' desk was a battlefield, files strewn across it like casualties, coffee rings staining the edges like bloodstains, a laptop glowing with Keller's training records. Carla had delivered by 9 a.m., dropping a stack of paperwork that thudded like a brick on the desk. "Keller's full history," she'd said, her voice tight. "And Hayes' stuff took some digging, but it's there. You owe me lunch for this." Marcus had nodded, already tearing into it, the pages fanning out like a deck of cards he was desperate to read. Keller wasn't an outlier, he was a product, molded by Hayes' Tactical Enforcement Initiative, a program that preached proactive policing code for stops and searches on gut instinct, no questions asked, no oversight needed. The training log stretched back a decade, Hayes' signature a recurring ghost on the dotted line, approving cohorts of cops like Keller, guys with short fuses and long grudges, unleashed on the streets with a playbook that said suspicion was enough. Marcus cross-referenced dates, names, locations, his pen scratching notes in the margins. Oak Park, 12 stops, 10 black drivers. Del Paso, 8 stops, all searched, no arrests. The pattern was a neon sign, blinking in his face. Keller wasn't freelancing. He was following orders, a soldier in Hayes' quiet war. He found a memo from Hayes, buried in a 2018 report. Effective policing requires instinct over evidence. Trust your gut, it's rarely wrong. Marcus snorted, a bitter laugh escaping him. Instinct, Hayes, code for prejudice, a free pass to target anyone who didn't fit the right profile. He dug deeper, pulling incident reports tied to Keller's stops, dozens of them, stretching back years, a trail of shaken drivers and empty searches, complaints that evaporated under Hayes' influence. One stood out. A 30-year-old mechanic, stopped for speeding at 32 in a 30, searched for 45 minutes, his tools dumped on the pavement, Keller claiming he looked nervous. No charges, no apology, just a note from Hayes. Officer acted within protocol. Marcus' phone rang, jolting him from the haze, the screen lighting up with an unknown number. Grayson, he answered, his voice rough from hours of silence. Mr. Grayson? A woman's voice, young, hesitant, barely audible over the hum of background noise traffic maybe, or a crowd. This is Officer Elena Vasquez. 2. Need to talk to you. Off the record. Marcus straightened, his gut tightening, a spark of adrenaline cutting through the fatigue. What's this about? A pause, then a whisper, shaky but resolute. Keller. I've got something you need to see, but if they find out I'm talking to you, I'm done career over. Maybe worse. Meet me, Marcus said, no hesitation, his mind already racing. Somewhere quiet. You pick. Riverfront Park. 6 p.m. by the benches near the oak grove. Don't bring anyone. Her voice cracked slightly, then steadied. Please. The line went dead. Marcus leaned back, the chair creaking under him, the pieces clicking into place like a puzzle he hadn't known he was solving. Keller was the spark, Hayes the fueland now. This rookie might be the match. He glanced at the clock, 10:37 a.m. 8 hours to prepare, to dig deeper, to brace for whatever bomb Vasquez was about to drop. By Wednesday, the ripples from the stop were swelling into waves, crashing against the city's fragile calm. Marcus hadn't filed an official complaint, not yet, but word had leaked, a slow drip that turned into a flood. A local activist group, Justice Now, caught wind of it. Someone had seen the flashing lights on El Camino, heard the exchange, pieced it together with whispers from the street. A flyer hit social media Tuesday night. Another black man targeted by Sacramento. PD, when will it stop? It didn't name Marcus, but the details were close enough. Suit, Camry, a cop with an attitude. By noon Wednesday, it had 10,000 shares. The comments a wildfire of rage and despair. Same shit. Different day. Cops think they're untouchable. My brother got stopped last week, same story. We're done with this. Marcus saw it on his lunch break, scrolling X at a deli near the office, the pastrami sandwich in front of him untouched. His stomach sank, a cold knot forming. This wasn't what he'd wanted, not yet. He'd planned to build a case, quiet and airtight, before going public gather the evidence, line up the dominoes, then knock them down with precision. But the community wasn't waiting for his timeline. They were tired, angry, their patience a thread worn to breaking. That night, a protest flared up outside Precinct 450 people at first, then 100, then 200, signs waving in the dusk. No justice, no peace, end racial profiling. Sacto PD, serve who? A news van rolled in, Channel 10's logo gleaming under the streetlights, cameras catching the chance, the clenched fists, the raw edge of a city teetering on fury. Inside the department, the air was thicker, uglier. Marcus felt it walking the halls to his office cops glaring over their coffee cups, whispers trailing him like smoke. Heard you're stirring shit, one officer muttered, a burly guy named Rollins, brushing past with a shoulder check that wasn't accidental. Good luck with that, IA. Another, a desk sergeant with a buzz cut, leaned over his counter, his voice low and venomous. You're making us look bad, Grayson. Hope it's worth it. Marcus kept his head up, his stride steady, but the weight pressed harder with every step. He was the enemy now, the suit who'd crossed the blue line, and they weren't shy about letting him know. Chief Ramirez called him in that afternoon, his office a fortress of oak and brass, the air heavy with the scent of old cigars and older regrets. Ramirez sat behind his desk, his salt and pepper hair catching the light, his face etched with fatigue and something sharper, disapproval, maybe, or dread. This Keller thing's blowing up, he said, rubbing his temples with thick fingers, his voice a gravelly rumble. Protesters out front, press calling non-stop. Channel 10's got a damn field day. You know anything about it? Marcus kept his expression neutral, his hands clasped in his lap, the badge in his pocket a silent anchor. Just doing my job, Chief. Looking into a stop that went sideways, mine as it happens. Ramirez leaned forward, his elbows thudding against the desk, his eyes narrowing. Your job's to keep this in-house, Grayson, not turn it into a circus. Hayes' pissed called me this morning, says you're targeting his guys, digging where you shouldn't. He's got half the brass riled up already. Let him be pissed, Marcus said, unflinching, his voice steady as steel. If his guys are clean, they've got nothing to worry about. but we both know clean's not the word for Keller or Hayes' little boot camp. Ramirez sighed, a heavy, resigned sound that filled the room like smoke. You're poking a bear, Marcus. A big one, with sharp claws and a long memory. Hope you're ready for what comes back. I've been ready, Marcus replied, a faint edge creeping into his tone. Question is, are you? 'Cause this isn't going away, not with the streets lighting up like this. Ramirez waved a hand, dismissive but uneasy. Handle it your way then. Just don't say I didn't warn you. Outside, the pressure doubled, a vice tightening around Marcus' chest. His phone buzzed as he left the chief's office. Jamal Carter, a Justice Now organizer he'd met at a community forum last year, his voice crackling through the line with urgency. Grayson, we need you at the protest tonight, Jamal said. No preamble, the chants audible in the background. People are pissed, they want answers, not promises. Your internal affairs tell them what's real, what's coming. I'm not a spokesman, Marcus shot back, his voice sharp as he ducked into a stairwell for quiet. I'm building a case, Jamal, not a megaphone. You want results? Let me work. Case won't mean shit if the streets burn first, Jamal countered, his tone hard but pleading. They trust you, man, more than they trust the suits on TV. Show up. Say something. Anything. We're at the precinct till midnight. Marcus hung up, his thumb hovering over the screen, torn between the fire in his gut and the ice in his head. The cops saw him as a traitor, a rat in a suit. The community saw him as a savior, a voice they'd been screaming for. Both wanted blood Kellers. Hayes, someone's, and he was caught in the crossfire, a tightrope walker with no net. He glanced at his watch, 3:15 p.m. 3 hours until his meet with Vasquez, 9 until the protest peaked. Time was a blade, and it was cutting fast. At 6 p.m. Marcus stood by the benches in Riverfront Park, the Sacramento River glinting under the fading sun, its surface rippling with the last gasps of daylight. The air was cool, thick with the scent of wet grass and diesel from the nearby freeway, the oak grove casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the path. He'd come alone, as promised, his suit jacket swapped for a plain gray hoodie, his hands shoved in his pockets to keep them still. The USB from Keller's file was in his briefcase, locked in the Camry insurance, leverage, whatever he needed it to be. His eyes scanned the park joggers, a kid on a scooter, an old man feeding ducks normal life ticking on while his teetered on the edge. Elena Vasquez appeared from the shadows of the oaks, her steps quick and uneven, her face half hidden under a black hoodie. She was in civvies jeans, sneakers, a backpack slung over one shoulder, her eyes darting like a hunted animal's, her breath shallow as she approached. She stopped a few feet away, her hands twisting the straps of her bag, her voice barely above a whisper. You, Grayson? Yeah, Marcus said, keeping his tone low, steady, his eyes locking onto hers. You Vasquez? She nodded, a quick jerk of her head, then glanced over her shoulder, her paranoia a living thing. This has to stay off the books. If they know him here, they won't, Marcus cut in, his voice firm but calm, a lifeline thrown across the gap. What've you got? She hesitated, then pulled a USB drive from her pocket, her fingers trembling as she held it out. Keller's dash cam 3 weeks ago. It's bad. He's not just reckless, he's a bully with a badge, targeting kids who can't fight back. And he's not alone. I've heard him talk, him and his crew. They've got a system, a playbook. Someone's covering for them. Marcus took the drive, the plastic cool against his palm, the weight of it electric, a live wire sparking in his hand. Why risk this, Vasquez? You're a rookie, whistleblowers don't last long in this game. She swallowed hard, her eyes flicking to the river, then back to him, a flicker of steel cutting through the fear. Because I can't sleep knowing I let it slide. That kitty was terrified, Grayson. Keller laughed like it was a game. I joined up to protect people, not to watch this shit happen. But if this comes back to me, am finished blacklisted, out on my ass, maybe worse. It won't, Marcus said, a promise he wasn't sure he could keep, but he'd damn well try. You're doing the right thing. That's more than most can say. She nodded again, slower this time, then stepped back, her voice dropping to a whisper. There's more where that came from, files, recordings, stuff they think is buried. I can get it, but I need time, and cover. You'll have it, Marcus said, slipping the USB into his pocket, his mind already racing. Lay low, keep your head down, I'll reach out. She turned and slipped away, a ghost vanishing into the dusk, her sneakers silent on the grass. Marcus stood there a moment longer, the river's murmur filling the silence, the USB a burning coal against his thigh. Keller was the tip. Hayes was the iceberg, and Vasquez had just handed him a pickaxe. He drove home, the city simmering around him, the protest chants echoing in his ears from miles away. The deeper he dug, the colder it got. But he was in it now, too deep to turn back, too pissed to stop. The Sacramento morning broke gray and heavy, clouds pressing low over the city, as Marcus Grayson maneuvered his Camry through traffic, the hum of the tires a steady pulse against the chaos in his head. It was Friday, 4 days since Elena Vasquez had slipped him the USB drive, 4 days since he'd watched Keller's dashcam footage and felt the anger ignite a slow, steady burn that hadn't dimmed. The kid's pleas, Keller's smug laugh, the casual cruelty, it wasn't just evidence. It was a wound, a mirror to every stop Marcus had endured, every time he'd been sized up and spat out by a badge. He'd spent those days building the case Keller's file a stack of red flags, Hayes' training logs a roadmap of corruption, Elena's intel a dagger he'd plunge into the heart of it all. But the city wasn't waiting for him to sharpen the blade. Protests had erupted like wildfires 500 strong outside Precinct 4 by Wednesday night, spilling into the streets, shutting down Florin Road with chants that rattled windows. Keller's gotta go. Hayes protects pigs. Signs bobbed in the dusk, scrawled with fury. No justice. No peace, and Channel 10 had looped the story relentlessly. A blurry photo of Marcus' Camry from the stop leaking online, time-stamped, undeniable. Justice Now had latched on, dubbing him the suit fighting back, a hero he hadn't signed up to be. Inside the department, the air had turned toxic. Cops who'd once nodded in the halls now glared, their whispers sharpening into threats. "Rat's gonna get what's coming," one hissed in the break room, loud enough to carry. Marcus had kept his stride steady, his jaw set, but the isolation was a cold weight, pressing harder with every step. Now, as he pulled into the internal affairs lot, his phone buzzed Carla, her voice tight, urgent. "Marcus, get up here, now. Shit's hitting the fan hard." "What's going on?" he asked, already out of the car, his briefcase slamming against his thigh as he strode toward the building, the asphalt slick with overnight rain. "Hayes," she said, "the name a curse. Hez on the warpath called an emergency meeting with the brass. Words spreading fast has got something on you. Something bad." Marcus' gut twisted, a cold spike piercing the anger that had kept him afloat. "On my way." He hung up, the elevator ride a blur of steel and silence, his mind racing. Hayes had been too quiet since Ramirez's warning, a predator lying in wait. This was the strike calculated brutal, and Marcus could feel the jaws closing in. He stepped into the fifth-floor conference room, the air thick with tension, the stale scent of coffee and sweat hanging like a fog. Chief Ramirez sat at the head of the table, his face a mask of exhaustion, his salt and pepper hair catching the fluorescent light. Flanking him were a half-dozen brass captains, lieutenants, Hayes loyalists, their badges gleaming like war medals, their eyes hard and unyielding. Victor Hayes stood at the far end, his suit crisp, his gray hair slicked back, his presence a storm rolling in. His gaze locked onto Marcus as he entered, a predator's glint cutting through the haze, his lips twitching into a smile that was all teeth, no warmth. "Grayson," Hayes said, his voice a low growl, smooth and deliberate, each syllable a hammer strike. "Good of you to join us. We've got a problem, and it's you." Marcus set his briefcase down, slow and deliberate, his pulse steady despite the fire roaring in his chest. "Funny, I was about to say the same about you, Deputy Chief. What's this about?" He kept his tone even, a steel thread running through it, refusing to flinch under Hayes' stare. Hayes slid a folder across the table, the pages fanning out like a deck of marked cards, his thick finger tapping it with a thud that echoed in the silence. "This," he said, "is evidence of your misconduct. Leaking department intel to the press, stirring up those protesters, undermining the force from the inside. You're a traitor, Grayson, and I've got the proof to bury you." The room went still, the brass shifting in their seats, eyes darting between Hayes and Marcus like spectators at a prize fight. Ramirez's jaw tightened, his hands clasped on the table, but he stayed silent, a man caught in the crossfire. Marcus stepped forward, flipping the folder open mails, grainy photos, a transcript, all stamped with official headers. His name was everywhere, tied to Justice Now's social media posts, a doctored shot of him at the protest he'd never attended, a supposed confidential tip to Channel 10 about Keller's stops, complete with timestamps and IP traces. It was a forgery, a house of cards built on lies, but it was too slick to dismiss outright, a masterpiece of manipulation. "This is bullshit," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade, sharp and unyielding, his anger flaring hot and red. "You think it'd tank my own career to play martyr? This is fabricated and you know it, Hayes. You're desperate, scrambling to cover your tracks. Do I?" Hayes leaned forward, his smile widening, a shark scenting blood in the water. "You've been digging into my programs. My officer's Keller's just the start. Your internal affairs, sure, but you've crossed a line. You're feeding the mob out there, turning them against us. I've got witnesses cops who saw you talking to activists, passing intel under the table. You're done, Grayson." Marcus' hands curled into fists, his nails digging into his palms, the rage surging like a tide he could barely hold back. "Witnesses? Your lapdogs, you mean guys you've trained to lie for you, to jump when you snap your fingers? This isn't about me, it's about covering your ass. Keller's a thug, a bully with a badge, and you made him that way. I've got the files, the training logs, the dashcam footage." "Careful," Hayes interrupted, his voice dropping to a hiss, his eyes narrowing to slits, a venomous edge cutting through his calm. "You're on thin ice, accusing me with no proof. That dashcam? Corrupted, inadmissible techs already confirmed it. Your files? Circumstantial at best, a fishing expedition. But this?" He tapped the folder again, his finger thudding like a gavel. "This sticks. You're a liability, and the department doesn't protect liabilities." Ramirez finally spoke, his voice rough, reluctant, gravel scraping over concrete. "Marcus, if there's truth to this, we've got no choice. Suspension's on the table pending investigation. You know how this works." "Investigation?" Marcus snapped, turning on him, his control slipping, the betrayal a bitter sting in his throat. "You're buying this crap? He's framing me, Chief turning me into the fall guy to save his empire of dirt. You let this stand. You're handing him the keys to keep running this shit show, Keller. The stops, the whole damn system. You're better than this." Ramirez flinched, his eyes flickering with doubt. But Hayes cut in, smooth as oil over a blade. "Enough. You're emotional, Grayson proving my point. You're out of control, a danger to the force. We're voting on it right here, right now." The brass murmured, heads nodding. Hayes men, bought and paid for, their loyalty a chain Marcus couldn't break. Captain Ortiz, a squat man with a buzz cut, grunted, "Has gone too far." Lieutenant Daniels, Hayes' right hand, added, "Suspension's light, he should be fired." The room tilted, the walls closing in, betrayal a bitter taste. Marcus swallowed hard. He'd seen corruption before, fought it tooth and nail, but this was personal knife in the back, twisted deep, the handle still in Hayes' grip. "You won't win this," Marcus said, locking eyes with Hayes, his voice low, a vow carved in stone. "I've got more than you think, more than your little paper trail can touch. I'm not going down quiet, and am damn sure not going alone." Hayes' smile didn't waver, cold and unyielding. "Well, see, Grayson. Well, see." The vote was quick 5-1, Ramirez abstaining, his silence a gut punch Marcus felt in his bones. "Suspended," Hayes declared, his voice ringing with triumph. "Effective immediately. Turn in your badge by end of day." Marcus stood there, the room a blur, the anger a furnace roaring in his chest. He grabbed his briefcase, his knuckles white, and walked out, Hayes' smirk burning into his back like a brand. This wasn't over not by a long shot. By Saturday morning, Hayes' trap had sprung wide open, the frame-up dossier leaking to the press like blood in the water. Channel 10 broke the story at 7 a.m. IA head turns rogue. Sparks protests, a headline that hit Sacramento like a Molotov cocktail. The report was merciless. Marcus Grayson, head of internal affairs, suspended amid allegations of leaking sensitive intel to activist groups, inciting unrest against the Sacramento PD. The forged emails flashed on screen. The doctored photo of Marcus at the protesta lies so bold it stole his breath. The anchor's voice droned. Sources say Grayson's actions have destabilized the force, fueling violent demonstrations. Clips rolled, protesters clashing with riot cops, tear gas clouding floor and road, a Molotov shattering against a precinct wall. Marcus watched it unfold from his living room, the TV's glare casting shadows across the hardwood. Lena beside him, her hands clenched in her lap. "They're lying," she whispered, her voice breaking, tears brimming in her eyes. "They're destroying yous. Why didn't you stop, Marcus? Why didn't you listen?" He reached for her hand, his own trembling, the guilt a stone in his gut. "I couldn't, Lena. Not with what I've seen what they're doing. I had to fight. And now," she snapped, pulling away, her voice rising, raw with fear and fury. "Now you're suspended. A target they're calling you a traitor on live TV. What's left to fight for when they've already won?" "They haven't," he said, his tone hard, resolute, the anger flaring anew. "Not yet. I've got evidence, real evidence. Keller, Hayes, the whole damn network. I'm not letting this stand." She shook her head, tears spilling now, her voice a broken plea. "They'll kill you," Marcus figuratively, maybe literally. "Please, just stop. For me, for us." He couldn't answer, couldn't promise not when the fire in him burned hotter than her fear. The TV cut to a press conference, Hayes at a podium, his suit impeccable, his voice steady. Grayson's actions endangered public safety. We're restoring order, rooting out disloyalty. The department stands united. The brass flanked him, a wall of blue, their faces grim but obedient. Marcus' stomach churned. Hayes wasn't just framing him. He was rewriting the narrative, turning the hunter into the hunted. Outside, the city boiled. Protests doubled 1,000 strong by noon, spilling from the precinct to City Hall. Chants of Grayson's a hero. Clashing with cops are corrupt. Riot cops pushed back, batons swinging, tear gas hissing, the air thick with rage and smoke. Justice nows. Jamal Carter called Marcus, his voice hoarse over the line. "They're lying about you, man, but it's waking people up. We're with you. Fight this." "I am," Marcus said, gripping the phone. The USB drives a lifeline in his pocket. "Stay safe out there." Inside the department, Marcus was a ghost desk cleared, access revoked, colleagues turning away like he was plague-ridden. Rollins smirked as he passed in the hall. "Told you. Rat game over." Marcus ignored him, his focus laser-sharp. Elena had come through Sunday night, slipping him a second drive in a diner parking lot, more dashcam clips. Audio of Keller bragging, "Hayes says we run the streets. Not them." A memo from Hayes greenlighting discretionary stops with no oversight. It was a gold mine, raw and damning, but it came with a cost. Elena's name was on it, her career a fraying thread. "They're watching me," she'd whispered, her eyes bloodshot, hands shaking. Ortiz asked where I've been. "I'm scared. Grayson but him in." He'd nodded, guilt clawing at him, but the stakes were too high to pull back. The media storm raged. Channel 10, CNN, X-posts exploding. Sacto PD a scandal. Justice for Grayson. Hayes doubled down. A second presser Monday. Grayson's a lone wolf, a rogue element. We're cleaning house. The lie stuck, the brass echoing it, the public splitting, some calling Marcus a whistleblower, others a villain. His phone buzzed non-stop, reporters, activists, threats, "You're dead, snitch." Lena stopped answering the door, the house a bunker under siege. The hearing came Tuesday, 10 a.m. A City Hall's council chamber, a powder keg 200 packed in, cops, press, activists, the air electric with fury and dread. Marcus walked in, suit crisp, head high, the drives burning in his pocket like live coals. Hayes sat at the front, flanked by his brass, his face a mask of calm control, his eyes glinting with menace. Ramirez presided, gavel in hand, his gaze avoiding Marcus, a man torn between duty and defeat. The crowd buzzed "Justice now" in the back, chanting "Truth now," until Ramirez banged for order, the sound a crack in the chaos. Hayes opened, his voice smooth, rehearsed, a predator playing prey. Marcus Grayson's a disgrace, leaking intel, inciting chaos, betraying the badge he swore to uphold. We've got emails, photos, testimony, irrefutable evidence of his disloyalty. Suspend him permanently, effective immediately. The department demands it. The brass nodded, a chorus of agreement, Ortiz grunting. "Hez a cancer," Daniels adding. "Hez lucky it's not jail." Marcus stood, his voice cutting through like a gunshot, sharp and unyielding, the anger a furnace roaring to life. "That's a lie, and I've got proof." He held up the drives, the room erupting gasps, shouts, cameras flashing, a wave of sound crashing against the walls. Keller stops, heinous orders years of abuse, covered up by this man right here. "This isn't about me. It's about a system you built to prey, not protect. You're the traitor, Hayes, not me." Hayes' mask slipped, his eyes narrowing to slits, but he recovered fast, his voice booming. "Fabrication's desperate lies from a desperate man. He's got nothing but smoke and mirrors." "Then let's see," Marcus said, slamming the drives on the table, his voice rising, raw with fury, the crowd feeding off it. "Play them. Right here, right now. Let the people decide who's lying." He turned to the audience, his eyes blazing, his words a rallying cry. "You deserve the truth, don't let him bury it." Ramirez hesitated, the room a pressure cooker, sweat beading on his brow, then nodded, his voice strained. "Play it." A tech scrambled, plugging in the first drive. Keller's footage flickered on a screen, the kid's pleas echoing through the chamber. "I don't have anything, please." Keller's laugh, low and ugly, the crowd gasping, some crying out, "Bastard." The second drive, Keller's voice, smug. "Hayes says we run the streets, not them." Followed by the memo, Hayes' signature bold. "Discretion is our strength. Use it." The chamber exploded shouts, curses, justice now surging forward, cops bristling, fists clenched. Hayes stood, his face red, veins bulging, his voice a roar. "This is a setup. Grayson's a fraud, those are doctored. You've got no chain of custody. No." "Shut up!" a woman screamed from the back, her voice breaking, tears streaming. "That's my son on that tape, you monster." The crowd surged, a tidal wave of rage, Ramirez banging the gavel. "Order! Order!" But it was lost, the room a cauldron boiling over. Marcus faced Hayes, his voice low, cutting through the chaos, a blade to the throat. "You're done, Hayes. The mask's off, everyone sees you now." Hayes leaned close, his breath hot, his eyes wild but cold. A predator cornered but not caged. "You think this ends it? You've got no idea what's coming, Grayson. You just signed your own ticket." He shoved past, storming out, the brass trailing, the crowd parting like a sea before a shark. Ramirez banged again, his voice hoarse. "Adjourned. Full investigation, independent review. No suspensions today." The gavel cracked, the sound swallowed by cheers, boos, the room splitting, half triumphant, half furious. Marcus stood there, chest heaving, the crowd roaring, but Hayes' words echoed, a chill snaking down his spine. He'd won the battle, but at what cost? That night, Marcus sat in his living room, the TV muted on a news loop, hearing Shock City, PD faces reckoning. Lena slept upstairs, exhausted from days of fear and fight, the house silent but for the hum of the fridge. The drives had worked, Keller was on leave, Hayes under scrutiny, the department cracking open like a rotten egg. Protesters had dispersed, some celebrating, others vowing more. But victory tasted hollow. The cost a jagged edge, Alina's career teetering. Her name whispered in the footage's fallout. Marcus' reputation scarred, a hero to some, a villain to others. The city still simmering, trust in the PD a threadbare rag. His phone buzzed Carla, her voice hushed, frantic. "Marcus, Hayes is gone. Left his office an hour after the hearing cleaned out. Desk empty, no trace. Brass says he's on leave, but I heard he's skipped town." Marcus' blood ran cold, the room tilting, his grip tightening on the phone. "Skipped? With what?" "Dunno," she said, her breath quick. "But there's chatter files missing, encrypted drives gone from the server. He's got connections, big ones, Marcus. I dug into his old cases links to LA, Chicago, even DC frames from cops in other cities. This isn't just Sacramento, he's part of something national." Marcus sat back, the pieces slamming together. Hayes calm at the hearing, his threat, the memo's weight, the missing files. He wasn't just a deputy chief. He was a cog in a machine, a network of corrupt cops stretching across state lines, untouchable. The hearing had cracked the surface, exposed the rot, but Hayes had slipped the net, leaving Marcus with a half-win and a new war shadow sprawling far beyond the city, a conspiracy he'd only begun to touch. He stood, pacing, the USB drives on the table glinting in the dim light. Carlos' voice crackled. What now? We keep fighting, he said, his voice steel, the anger reigniting. A vow to himself, to Lena, to the kid on that tape. He's not gone, he's running, and him not stopping till he's down. She paused, then, Be careful, Marcus. This is bigger than we thought. He hung up, the silence heavy. Hayes' words a ghost in his ear. You've got no idea what's coming. The fight had just begun, and the next punch would hit harder than he'd ever imagined. The Sacramento dawn crept through the blinds of Marcus Grayson's living room, soft gray light spilling across the hardwood, casting stripes over the coffee table where the USB drive still sat small, unassuming relics of a war he'd fought and half won. It was Wednesday, 8 days since the hearing that had cracked the Sacramento PD wide open. 8 days since Victor Hayes had slipped away like smoke through his fingers. Marcus sat on the couch, a mug of black coffee cooling in his hands, the steam curling up like ghosts of the chaos he'd left behind. His suit jacket hung over a chair, rumpled from days of wear, his tie long discarded. The house was quiet, Lena still asleep upstairs, the hum of the fridge the only sound breaking the stillness, but his mind was a storm, churning with what-ifs and what-nows. The TV flickered on mute, Channel 10 replaying the hearing's aftermath on a loop clips of the crowd's roar, Keller's dashcam footage, Hayes' stormy exit. The ticker read, Sacto PD under fire, reforms promised after IA expos. It should have felt like Victory Keller on leave, Hayes under investigation, the department forced to face its rot. But it didn't. The win was partial, jagged, a broken thing that cut as much as it healed. Elena Vasquez's name had leaked in the footage's fallout, their career teetering, her future a question mark Marcus couldn't answer. His own reputation was a battlefield hero to some, traitor to others. His suspension lifted, but his badge tarnished. The protests had quieted, the city catching its breath, but trust in the PD hung by a thread, and Hayes' escape loomed like a shadow he couldn't shake. Marcus set the mug down, untouched, and leaned back, his eyes tracing the ceiling's crack-soled scars in the plaster, like the ones he carried inside. He'd fought for this, for the kid on that tape, for every driver like him who'd felt the weight of a cop's glare, for the badge to mean something more than power. But the cost was steep. Lena's tears, her pleas to stop, echoed in his head, a refrain he couldn't silence. The department was cracking open, yes, but Hayes was out there free, connected, a predator waiting to strike again. Marcus had won the battle, but the war, that was a ghost haunting his every breath. His phone buzzed on the table, jolting him from the spiral. Elena Vasquez, her name a flicker of light in the haze. He answered, his voice rough from disuse. Vasquez, you okay? A pause, then her voice, shaky but steady, cutting through the static. Yeah, Grayson, barely. Ortiz hauled me in yesterday, grilled me about the footage. They know it's me, but they can't prove it yet. I'm on desk duty, pending review. Marcus' chest tightened, guilt a cold fist around his heart. I'm sorry, Elena. I promised you cover. Stop, she cut in, firm but not harsh. I knew the risk. I chose this same as you. We did something real, Marcus. That kid's mom came by the precinct, thanked me, crying. Said her son's sleeping again. That's worth it, even if they bury me for it. He exhaled, the weight shifting slightly, her words a lifeline he hadn't known he needed. You're tougher than you look, rookie. She laughed, a small, brittle sound. Gotta be. You're not rid of me yet, meet me later? Coffee, somewhere quiet. I need to get out of my head. Yeah, he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. The first in days. 11 a.m., that diner on J Street. We'll figure this out together. Deal, she said, and hung up, leaving him with a spark of something, hope, maybe, or just the comfort of not being alone. Upstairs, the floor creaked, Lena awake, her footsteps soft but deliberate as she descended. She appeared in the doorway, her hair loose, her eyes red-rimmed but clear, a mug of tea cradled in her hands. She wore his old college hoodie, the sleeves swallowing her wrists, a silent claim on him that softened the ache in his chest. You didn't sleep, she said. Not a question. Her voice quiet but heavy with worry. Couldn't, he admitted, meeting her gaze, the distance between them a chasm he longed to bridge. Too much noise up here. He tapped his temple, a half-smile fading fast. She crossed the room, settling beside him, her warmth seeping into his side as she leaned against him. You won, Marcus. Keller's out. Hayes is running there scared of you. Why doesn't it feel like enough? He wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close, her tea's chamomile scent grounding him. Because it's not finished. Hayes is gone, yeah, but he's not down. And Elenash is paying for it, Lena. I dragged her in, and now she's dangling. I keep seeing that kid's face, hearing his voice, and it's good, but it's not enough when the rot's still out there. She tilted her head, her eyes searching his, soft but piercing. You can't fix it all, you know. Not alone. You've been carrying this like it's yours to bear, but it's not. It's bigger than you, bigger than us. I know, he said, his voice low, rough with the truth he'd been dodging. But I started it. I can't walk away. Not when it's personal, not when it's us. He squeezed her shoulder, the memory of every stop, every slur, every time he'd bitten his tongue flashing through him. You've seen it how they look at me, at us. I had to fight, Lena. For you, for me, for what's right. She set her mug down, turning to face him fully, her hands cupping his face, her thumbs brushing the stubble on his jaw. I'm proud of you, she said, her voice breaking, tears brimming again. So damn proud. But I'm scared too. You're my husband, not a superhero. I need you here whole, not broken. He covered her hands with his, the warmth of her touch a balm against the storm. I'm here, he said, a promise he meant with every fiber. I'm not breaking, not yet. We'll get through this, together. I just need you with me. She nodded, leaning in, her forehead resting against his, their breaths mingling in the quiet. Always, she whispered, and for the first time in weeks, the weight lifted just a little, just enough to breathe. At 11 a.m., Marcus sat in a corner booth at the J Street Diner, the air thick with the scent of frying bacon and burnt coffee, the hum of chatter a low buzz around him. Elena slid in across from him, her hoodie swapped for a denim jacket, her eyes shadowed but sharp, a paper cup of coffee clutched like a lifeline. She looked younger out of uniform, vulnerable but resolute, a spark of defiance in her slump. You look like hell, she said, a faint smirk tugging at her lips, breaking the ice. Pot calling the kettle, he shot back, matching her smirk, the banter a small relief. How you holding up? She shrugged, sipping her coffee, her fingers tapping the cup. Desk duties a slow death-filing reports while Ortiz glares like him a cockroach. They're digging, Marcus trying to pin the leak on me. If they find proof, I'm out. They won't, he said, leaning forward, his voice firm. Well, bury it, shift the focus. The hearing's got them scrambling. They're too busy covering their asses to nail you. She nodded, but doubt lingered in her eyes. Maybe. But I keep thinking, what if I'd kept quiet? That kid's safe now, yeah, but I'm dangling. Was it worth it? Marcus leaned back, his gaze steady, the question one he'd wrestled with too. Yeah, it was. That kid's mom thanking you? That's real. We shook the tree. Elena fruits falling, even if it's messy. You're not dangling alone, I've got your back. Her smirk softened, a flicker of gratitude cutting through the fatigue. Thanks, Grayson. You're a stubborn bastard, you know that? Part of the charm, he said, a chuckle escaping, the first real laugh in days. Stick with me, rookie. We're not done shaking things. They talked for an hour strategy, next steps, a quiet pact forming over cooling coffee. Elena wasn't just a source anymore. She was a partner, a soldier in the same trench, her grit a mirror to his own. As they parted, she gripped his hand, her voice low. We're in this, right? No backing out? No backing out, he said, squeezing back, the bond sealed. Back home, the afternoon unfolded slow and soft, a rare pause in the storm. Lena was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables, the rhythmic thud of the knife a steady beat. Marcus joined her, grabbing a carrot, peeling it with a focus that felt almost meditative. You cooking for an army? He asked, nodding at the pile carrots, onions, peppers, a pot simmering with broth. She smiled, small but real, the first he'd seen in weeks. Thought we could use something warm stew again. You're helping, so don't mess it up. Yes, Mom, he said, saluting with the peeler, earning a laugh that warmed him more than the stove. They worked side by side, the clatter of pots and the hiss of oil a quiet symphony, their movements syncing like old times. It wasn't grand just stew, just them, but it was everything, a reclaiming of normalcy amid the wreckage. Dinner was simple, the table set for two, the stew rich and hearty, steam curling between them. Lena reached for his hand, her fingers lacing through his, her voice soft. "This you sits enough, Marcus. Whatever comes next, we've got this." He squeezed back, the warmth of her hand anchoring him. "Yeah, we do. Always." Later, they sat on the couch, a blanket draped over them, the TV off, the silence a comfort. Lena's head rested on his shoulder, her breathing slow, and Marcus felt the pieces settle not whole, but close, a family stitched back together by threads of trust and time. Thursday brought change, tentative but real. Marcus met Chief Ramirez at City Hall, the air crisp with fall, the council chamber quieter now, the chaos of the hearing a fading echo. Ramirez looked older, his eyes sunken, but there was a resolve in his slump Marcus hadn't seen before. "Independent reviews in motion," he said, handing Marcus a folder new protocols, typed and stamped. "Body cams mandatory, stop quotas scrapped, training overhauled, no more discretionary bullshit. Hayes programs are dead officially." Marcus flipped through it, the pages crisp, the words a hard-won promise oversight committee established, civilian input required. "This for real, Chief? Or just paper to wave at the cameras?" "For real," Ramirez said, his voice rough but firm. "You forced it. Grayson bloodied our nose, but it's working. Keller's out pending charges assault, misconduct. Community's watching. We can't backslide." Marcus nodded, the weight lifting slightly, a crack of light in the dark. "And Hayes?" Ramirez's jaw tightened, his eyes dropping. "Still gone. No trace feds are sniffing, but he's a ghost. We found scraps encrypted emails, transfers to offshore accounts. He's not just running, he's planning." The chill returned. "Hayes threat you've got no idea what's coming," a specter Marcus couldn't banish. He tucked the folder under his arm, his voice steady. "Keep digging, Chief. He's not done and neither am I." Friday, Marcus stood at a community forum, a small crowd 50, maybe 60 gathered in a church basement, the air thick with coffee and cautious hope. Jamal Carter introduced him, his voice booming. "This man took on the machine, give him your ears." Marcus stepped up, no notes, just truth, his voice raw but clear. "We won something," he said, eyes sweeping the room, mothers, workers, kids, faces like his own. "Keller's gone, rules are changing, because you fought, because we pushed. But it's not over. Hayes is out there, and the system's still cracked. I'm not here to promise miracles, I'm here to say the fight's never over, but it's worth starting. For you, for me, for every kid who deserves better." The applause was quiet, steady, a ripple of trust rebuilt. A woman, the kid's mom from the tape, hugged him after, her tears soaking his shirt. "Thank you," she whispered. And Marcus felt it, the why, the worth. A piece of peace. Back home, night fell, the city quiet but restless. Marcus sat on the porch, Lena beside him, the stars faint above the haze. His phone buzzed. Carla, a text. "Feds found a lead Hayes linked to a cop ring, coast to coast. Watch your back." He showed Lena, her hand tightening on his, fear flickering but not breaking her. "Has coming," she said, a statement, not a question. "Maybe," Marcus replied, his voice steel, his arm around her. "But we're ready. The fight's never over." "But it's worth starting," she finished, a small smile breaking through, their vow a quiet flame against the dark. The cliffhanger hung Hayes out there, a shadow stretching far, a war paused but not ended. Marcus leaned into Lena, the night stretching on, hope and dread entwined, the battle's next chapter unwritten but inevitable.